What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hatness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the quest to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Nick Sousanis, and we have a slightly different conversation since he is not a workshop facilitator, but an academic and a comic book drawer, writer, thinker. And we're talking about his piece of art, which is called Unflattening. So stay tuned to join the exploration of Unflattening. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, why don't you visit workshops.work and download my free one-page summary. Enjoy the show. Hello, Nick, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I'm pretty excited to explore the world of Unflattening, a book that I recently came across. And when I read it, I just thought that the world of facilitation needs to know about it. So I'm glad that you're joining this exploration experiment about the world of facilitation.
Yeah, I'm grateful to be here and to learn more about that whole world as well.
Yeah. And maybe just to start with a little bit of introduction or background. So you wrote the book Unflattening, and if I'm not mistaken, it was your dissertation.
That's correct. So it's hard to say about its firstness or not, but this was my dissertation at Teachers College at Columbia University. That is entirely written and drawn in comic book form, and the version that was published by Harvard University Press is more or less the same as what I submitted for my dissertation. The cover is new. There's some of the chapter title pages were not drawn for the dissertation, and there was some copy editing and a few things that I just had a little bit more time to go back and redraw. But other than that, that's what I submitted. It's essentially the same.
And I wonder what prompted you to draw your dissertation, or is it something that is quite normal? And what let you, maybe I let you answer this one first.
Yeah, it's definitely not quite normal, as I learned. I mean, I think I partly did it out of ignorance or naiveness. I was a comics person. I was a comics reader and maker. As a kid, I made my own comic through high school. And then I have this sort of lull in my comics making through undergraduate times where I studied other things, and we could talk about that another point. But as I sort of returned to them and I saw what I could do with them, the kind of ideas, educational ideas I could get across without dumbing it down, I saw this way to bring together all the things that were important to me and do it as my work. I have an undergraduate in mathematics, and then I have a gap in time, and then I come back and I did a mixed master's in art mathematics and a master's in fine arts. And then I have another gap, and then I come back and do the doctorate. And I really like being part of academia, but I think I was always a little uncomfortable that things there tended to stay there. They didn't tend to go out. And I think in my own, I made these comics, but I think my own view of comics was that they were entertainment. I didn't see them as what I see them now. So I think when I sort of came to that realization, I said, oh, well, I can bring together this thing I love to do, this way I love to work, and make work that is complex, sophisticated, but also accessible at the same time. And so when I applied to doctoral program, I said, this is the kind of work I want to do. And because of things like Art Spiegelman's Mouse and Persepolis, Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis, and Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, all those things were out there at that point, that I just assumed this argument was long over. Like of course you can do it in comics. It didn't seem like that big a deal, but it was a bigger deal than I realized, which was to my benefit because there was a lot more interest in it than I ever expected there to be. Because it just isn't something that had happened in academia at all. So yeah, I think that's how I came to do it. I just sort of stumbled into it because it's what I like to do.
I wouldn't have called myself a comic person. And what I find fascinating is that through your book, you can really dive into and explore, and there are so many facets. and you called it unflattening. And for me, this is really what happened to me, that it opened new perspectives on things that seemed so normal that I wouldn't have expected otherwise. So what prompted you to come up with the concept of unflattening? In which situation or from which instance was the idea born?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a roundabout way. I think so my first semester at Columbia, I made comics for some of my classes, and in my research class, I sort of studied comics makers as if they were researchers for my work. So I'm pretty sure that that word comes up right away in that semester, that I was thinking about how much information you could put on a comics page. And even though it's a flat piece of paper and it's static, that with the sort of layering of multiple images, how they're divided up into panels, how words layer over them and interact with them, that all of a sudden you could put more information than seemed possible in this single sheet of paper. And I described it then as this sort of unflattening to make it more dimensional. So it came, it's not apparent from the book, but it came very much out of thinking about how comics could do this thing. And then my own background, as I mentioned before, I have this math and art background. And I also, I was a very bottom level pro tennis player for a few years. And then I made my living all the way through doctoral school as a tennis pro. So I taught most of my teaching was involved in that. So, I saw these, coming from these different perspectives, and I'm teaching tennis and I'm thinking about how you might use an analogy of like making a brush stroke to think about how you put topspin on a ball, or talking about the physics of why spin works, to talk about why topspin works, to talk about why you want to swing a certain way. So, I really saw that this idea of interdisciplinarity, coming from multiple perspectives, was also another kind of unflattening, quite literal. And working in image and text, so that was another, so it was not just different disciplines, but also different modes of working. There's probably a few more ways I mean it. As you started to think about it, all these other things start to like come into the picture. And I know often people say, because I use the example of Flatland, Edwin Abbott's 1880s novella, Flatland, in there. But that was more of an afterthought. I knew the book, and because I had all these sort of examples of things being flat and then less flat, that, it ended up, it was at the end of the book I was going to mention it, and then that's one of the few things that sort of changed from my massive sketched out outline, and it moved near the front, and it really helped me explain what it is I meant by it, or let's give people a sense of it, because I don't think I ever explained what I mean by unflattening.
Yeah, you leave it to the exploration and the imagination of the reader.
Yeah. There's this simple example of Eratosthenes, I don't know, simple, but figuring out the circumference of the Earth from two different points on the Earth, and the shadows cast then at the same time from 2,000 years ago. And in that sort of drawing of it, sort of to help me think about what I meant by this term, how we come from different points. Yeah.
And it's interesting because from what I hear is that it started in a quite literal sense. So that you have a flat piece of paper, and by drawing on it and adding words, you add more dimensions. So it's unflattening. But then unflattening becomes like a view of the world almost. And I wonder, to what extent does it relate to thinking out of the box?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And I certainly in that first chapter deal with boxes a lot, and I think about boxes, I think about my own sort of schooling or as somebody that is in, if you're in the math box, you're not supposed to be in the art box, right? Mm-hmm. And if you're in a sports box, you're definitely you're not supposed to. And I think that those are boxes we made up, right? Like we made up these boxes and said, and when we call them real, when really the boxes are artificial. So that's one, and that's not answering your question yet, but that's one thing I was definitely very concerned with. And I think schooling becomes a series of boxes, where it's like you have a box of subject, you have a box of time, and you have the literal box of space. Like this is where your learning has to happen and what it looks like. And I wanted to sort of push back against those kind of boxes. The out of the box thing, I have to say I'm a little mixed on the expression in general. Like I get it and I appreciate being lumped in with that, but I also think you never get out of boxes, right? And I made a piece before this about that. And it's in here a little bit, but like my whole book is about like how I made the book is I make specific rules for myself. So it's a book to me that's very much about education, but the word education, the word schools, the word teachers, none of those words ever appear. It's rooted in lots of disciplines. None of those ever appear. So there's a very conscious like stripping out of language. There's no story. There's no sort of narrative or characters in any real way. So those are removed. And then each page tends to have its own series of like how I want you to read it or how the structure is. So I'm always building this series of boxes around myself to say, here's a bunch of constraints. Now, how do I find my way, not out of them, but how do I like create from them? So, and as much as I think that some of the points of the later chapters, as much as we want to like sort of free ourselves from the sort of boxes or strings, as I called it in the later chapters, you still have them. You still came from a particular place. Your parents are who they are. You still have these things. You still got gravity. Like it's hard to cut all of those things away. The laws of physics are still going to apply. So I think it's really important to see the boxes we're in. It's really important to see the sort of things that make us who we are, make our systems the way they are, and then see how we can sort of play within those boundaries and push on them. But the sort of leaping out of it, that one feels a little less, I'm not sure I'm articulating it very well, but I think it's more about how we sort of use those boxes to free ourselves rather than getting rid of them. It's that.
So is it a matter of growing the box in which we're sitting or decorating the box?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be all of those things. Mm-hmm. I think it can be all of those things. But I don't, there's still boundaries that are part of our lives. And I think the awareness of the boundaries is as important as saying I'm totally out of it, because I'm not. There's still boxes that I'm in, or boxes that I've created for myself, or if that makes sense. And you can challenge it too.
No, I'm just, there's so much to unpack there. Starting from how and it sounds as if you consciously decided to leave out everything that could label a box. So you leave out the character, the narrative, the reference to education, the reference to any scientific fields. Was this a conscious?
Oh yeah, very much so. So my sort of return to comics making as an adult happened around the 2004 U.S. presidential election. I was invited to be in an art show in Detroit where I ran an arts magazine, and I only had a couple days to do it. So I was like, well, I'll make a comic. And I made this first comic book before the election, and then there was a second show after. And I made the second one, and it's the second one, it's on my website, that really, really shaped my way of working. I mean, at that point, the first one's a little bit more me, like I'm there and I'm sort of narrating and pointing out things. The second one it's about voting, or, a show of hands. So it's every image is something to do with a hand. And my goal with the work was thinking about how, like, I think it's very easy to make a political cartoon that says the other side sucks, right? Or rah, rah for us. I think that's an easy thing to do. And I appreciate some of them, and they're, very clever and skilled. But for me, I was like, well, how do I get somebody who doesn't already agree with me to at least stay in the conversation? Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean they're going to, winning people over or whatever. That's more complicated. But how do I make something that says you can stay with this conversation and you can take something from it, as opposed to being turned off with the first word that's in there? And I think about, I've made subsequent ones around that, and then that came into my academic work too. It's like, you may not be versed in, certain kinds of educational theories or whatever that I have now read, but that doesn't mean there shouldn't be a way into the conversation for you. And it's a tricky thing. I mean, I'm sure, there's ways that my work is going to be interpreted that I didn't mean, but most of those are rewarding. I mean, here I am talking about in a very different area than I anticipated, because I think in that opening, people can find their way in. And I think one of the most interesting conversations, that's too big a word, interesting snippets of the conversation or responses to the work We lived on the Spanish Harlem in New York City, the upper East Side. And there's these guys that lived somewhere in the neighborhood, but they hung out on our stoop all the time. And I at some point, I gave him some of the comics I made. And I saw the guy the other day, a couple days later, and he said, I said, "What do you think?" He said, "Yeah, man, it's all about perception. It's all about how we see things." And I was like, yeah, and this is a guy who I'm pretty sure, didn't finish high school, is making money on, doing something that we might not classify as proper or something, and definitely hasn't, gone to higher education or anything like that. But he really got it. He really got it, and I felt like that meant a lot to me. Like I think, people are very capable, competent creatures if you give them a chance to be. And I think a lot of language, specific language can be a barrier to communication. And I'm not saying that what I'm doing can bring everybody into it, but that's how I'm approaching it.
So basically, by removing all these labels, you open it up for everyone to join and to find their own understanding in it. Because if you remove the label education, then people can explore what they see in the picture without being primed on, oh, okay, this is about education, so I have to put on this lens in order to see it that way.
Again, that's my hope. Obviously it can backfire, but to me, that's valuable. And it's one of the most interesting things. I know, college classes that teach it. I remember one professor who did telling me, like, he always starts with the question, like, what is it about? And here I kind of picture that students would see it as education, but that's, teachers do. Teachers very much see it that way. But students who are, headed to random degrees, they don't, it's pretty rare that they see it that way. And that's great for me. I think I learned so much from seeing how people read it.
And I would like to come back to what you said about this presidential campaign.
Yeah.
So, and this is something to open a conversation, to create space where difficult conversations can happen. This is pretty much at the core of a facilitator. So how can we get the boxes to communicate with each other, basically?
Yeah.
And to open to hear each other's arguments. So how did you do it? So what is your skill of the magic ingredient that you...
I don't know. And it's interesting. I titled a class, my first class when I came to SF State, the only sort of writing class I taught, The Having of Difficult Conversations. And this was in 2016, the fall of 2016. And thinking about that concept, like how does interdisciplinarity help that? How does words and pictures help that? I can only tell you how I do it. But I can't even tell you that really. I don't even think I can tell you that. But I think, maybe it's an assumption that at some point we're all not that different. And I think the things that connect us are certainly stronger than the things that keep us apart. But I do think there are particular ways of seeing the world that keep us apart. And if you can create things that help people stick around longer, that maybe they get past it. If you can prevent ways that people start to work to, I don't do that kind of facilitation so much, so that's harder for me to answer, but at least how I see it, how can I make this thing that you'll read it and it works for you and it hasn't kept you out? I guess I already said that, but I think that's the thing. And maybe that's a naive point of view. Maybe there are some people, I made a piece recently around that for the current situation. And, are there some people you're just not ever going to bring into the conversation? Maybe not.
Black Lives Matter.
I just was referring to everything in the last 3.5 years in my country. I actually made it a couple weeks. I made it before all of this too. So, but are there some people that just aren't coming back to be in the conversation? And I don't know. I'd like to think you can still try. I do believe if people can see how the things connect them, that maybe they can get past their own limited sight. And I say that to myself too. It's not like I'm claiming any kind of genius sight or anything. I think how do we find ways to get to see from different perspectives. And I think that's obviously the hardest question. And it's certainly the hardest question maybe of our point in time right now.
Yeah. And I somehow thought, while I heard you speaking, I thought about a piece of art, that you look at a piece of art and then it kind of triggers a conversation, but it's rather neutral. When I think of a political campaign, it's not neutral. And still, so I have the impression that it's a fine line between being sufficiently provocative so that communication will emerge and both sides want to stick around long enough, and not too provocative for them to get enraged and then to pass over this and refuse to communicate.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think you said it well. I think that's a tricky dance, right? Like I said, I'm not interested in making the piece that says, rah, rah, this is what you should think. But it's not like I don't have a point of view. And it's not like I don't have a very strong point of view. And it's also, I think there's definitely a risk with the word unflattening and some of the approaches that it can devolve into a kind of relativism. Like we should hear all sides are equal. Mm-hmm. And I don't think, I think climate change is such a great example of that. Yes, there are climate change deniers, but if they're coming from a perspective that's not based on any sort of honesty, mm-hmm. That's not, that's like having, using two eyes, but one of your eye is like giving you false information all the time. You're going to have to learn to ignore that eye, right? Like, otherwise you're going to run into stuff. So I understand how mine might be construed as that kind of relativism, and I'm quite leery of it. But I do think, having all the stakeholders, having all the different takes in a conversation really matters. Anyway, I don't know. I'm getting a little probably beyond what I understand. Doesn't take much. But.
I wouldn't say that. Would you consider unflattening then as a mindset or as a journey or as a philosophy or as a state of being or a destiny?
Oh. Did you say destiny or destination? I didn't hear the last one.
Destiny, but maybe destination is better.
I would say no to the last one. And I would say, I think yes to all the others. I mean, I think it says it somewhere in there, and I don't have the book in front of me. I mean, I think it's an attitude, but I wanted to think about it as an attitude or an orientation. Like, how do we sort of approach things so that we can understand more? And, I think that's, and this is getting ahead of the questions here, but, I think it's one reason, as I mentioned, that there's a lot of ways people do typos to unflattening. I get unflattering a lot, and that's, annoying, but whatever, that happens. But the one I really don't like is when people call it unflattened, with the ED ending. And I think the problem with that is it implies something that's finished, implies that there's like a state of unflattenness or something that you can reach. And I was super resistant to that. Like it's very intentionally an ing there so that you understand it's something you're always striving for. Again, coming back, it's an attitude for how do we grow rather than a place to reach. And I think the danger for all of us is becoming stagnant. The danger is saying, we're going to reach some place, and then we know all the answers, and then we can stop. And I think that can happen with the most enlightened point of view, and it can happen with the worst kind of views. Either of those can lead to this really stagnant and unhealthy place. But if you keep accepting that you don't know everything and there is so much more to understand, I think that at least keeps you moving and keeps you alive in your thinking.
And I wonder, is there a technique that you can practice this unflattening attitude, that you would look at the same plant every day and try to find new ways of looking at it or drawing it or...
I like that. That's a nice idea. It's interesting. I was just out with my daughter, 6, and my boy was a year and a half, but mostly it was with my daughter. And we were looking at a bee on like a 1 foot square of stuff. And then we started noticing other insects crawling up there. And we spent a long time. And I think the idea that you can look at a 1 foot square of space and say, what's going on in here? And your first look at it is, well, there's some flowers there, done. But as you look longer, you start to, you reel this whole life. So I think your perspective is really good there. Let me try to tie this back to the previous answer. I was a student of Maxine Greene, a philosopher of aesthetic education at Columbia from, I don't know, she was there for like 60 years or something. She was 90 when I had my first class with her in her living room, and 96 when I had my defense with her in her living room about a few weeks before she died. She's really a phenomenal philosopher. And her big work, and I think this connects to your previous conversation, is that art has this transformative potential. And the class I had with her was very much how looking at a piece of work and certain pieces of work could make you more empathic. And I say this, after her passing, myself and another student of hers, we made a comic about the view out her window. And you would go visit her. She lived right near the Guggenheim over Central Park. So she was looking into the park, and there was a tree outside her window. And because she wasn't very mobile, so she always sat in the same place, and you would come visit her and have lunch maybe, and you would sit there. And so we, for the first time, sat where she sat, and we looked at this tree that she'd looked at. And I could send you the comic, but the comic is about looking at this tree. I think that each time she looked out, she was seeing something new in the tree outside her window. Whether, obviously there's seasonal change, but there's daylight change, there's storm change, there's what's in the tree, there's the bus that goes under the tree with the tourists on it every 15 minutes or something. The tree became this way, I think, of sort of practicing her philosophy of seeing, and she's very much about seeing otherwise, trying to see things in ways that they weren't already defined as. And I think that's an absolute thing you can practice. You start looking at the tree. Are you paying attention to its bark? Are you paying attention to its root system, how its roots have pushed up the concrete down below the tree, and how the passerby sort of has to adjust their walking to it? So I think I think you said it much more efficiently than I did. But I think that is the kind of mindset we're talking about. How do we come at something from all these different ways of looking and keep remembering to do that?
How can we remember to do that when it comes to something that is not as neutral as a tree? So for instance, climate change. Does it require empathy or just curiosity or the scientific mindset?
Yes. Yes, it requires all of those, right? I mean, not everybody's going to be a scientist, so there's that. But I don't know. Again, I said before, I think thinking about how we're connected. We're connected through what we breathe. We're connected by water. As we're seeing right now, we are connected by viral organisms. These things are connecting us, and we can try to pretend we're not, but that's really foolish. And, I think you can connect it to the current situation, the very immediate situation in my country. If people are being oppressed, that you can say, well, that's other people, but that's all part of you. And it has an effect on you, whether you want to pretend it doesn't or not. So I think helping people, let me back up one more time on this. So my dad's a physics teacher and my mom is an environmental studies educator for little kids. And I think the environmental studies perspective, the main thing I would take from it is seeing connections, seeing how an ecosystem works. And I think understanding that, I don't think you can look at anything without having that perspective. And there's a page in Unflattening, which this is a change from the dissertation view. My mom is cited in it. She's not cited in the book. We cut that out. But it's the page about, it's got the citation from James Joyce. It says, "Did it flow?" And it's about the water flowing, and the page sort of flows across the page. And I had read that. I read Ulysses in high school, and I can't say that I made heads or tails of the book, but that particular passage has always sort of been a transformative moment for me, in that it's a simple act of turning on a faucet, right? Like we do it all the time. You do it without thinking. But the passage then goes into who dug the well and the amount of water pressure, and it has all these things, and it probably has actually less than I imagine it has. And I tried to show that in the image. If you start thinking about how this very smallest actions that we do every day, what happens when you turn on a water faucet? Who forged it? Where do those pipes? You live in a city that's 100 years old or something or more. Where are those pipes? Who made those pipes? Who even knows where those pipes are anymore? Like, there's all these connections that you start to see. And I think that is the kind of attitude or orientation that if you have it, it's hard to, it might be hard to shut that off, because you probably need to once in a while. But I think if you have it, it forces you to start looking at things in a different sort of way. So I think your exercise that you suggested at the start before I went and rambled on all of this, I think that makes a lot of sense as a way to train people to think about that, or to push, not train. I don't think training in that, but to sort of open that kind of eyesight.
Hi, this is Andrew. I'm a facilitator and head of customer success at Session Lab, the dynamic workshop planner tool. More than 30,000 facilitators, trainers, and coaches use our workshop planner tool and save time and effort in the design process. So, how do they do it? Our drag and drop agenda builder makes it easy to transform your ideas into high-quality workshops, and the timing of your agenda automatically updates when you make changes. You can collaborate in real time with your colleagues and easily share professional-looking printouts with your clients. And if you need inspiration, you can check out our library of more than 500 activities and exercises and simply drag the ones you need right into your workshop agenda. So check out Session Lab to save time and effort in your workshop design process. And now get your first 2 months of Session Lab Pro absolutely free at sessionlab.com/workshopswork.
What is it that pictures can teach us or tell us that words cannot?
That's a really good question. You'd think I'd have been asked that in all these years of talking about this. I'm not sure I have. That's a great question. I mean, what can they teach us? I mean, there's maybe the more obvious things, like the sort of emotional capacity for an image. And, so there's that. But I also think there's talking about connectedness here, there's that aspect of it. And it's something I think about a lot in comics, and even more than I did in the book as I go forward. But it's like, how do you draw connections across? I mean, the simplest example I'll give from my book is the symbol that I sort of came up for unflattening. And it comes out of that Eratosthenes drawing, and then it shows up like 6 times in the book or something. And people have different ideas on what it is, and that maybe got out of my control a little bit. But the point is, it's never said, right? There's nothing that says, here's a symbol and it means a certain thing. It's just there. So then when you see it a second, a third, a 5th time, you can't help but start to draw these connections. And they're connections that are totally not in the verbal realm. And I think, that's an example, sort of obvious example in the book, but I think those kinds of things, I think that's one of the strengths of comics, is you can link these different ideas or different instances in time through images that we recall, our visual recall is very strong, and start to sort of thread a narrative through it that's different than the narrative in the words, and different even in the narrative than the story, which isn't quite the same thing as the words. Like it's something else that's sort of going on in there. There's only one aspect of how pictures help us, but I think that's an important one.
Yeah, I think the pictures are also free of right or wrong or any judgment. So whatever you see in a picture is just right for you, but then, and maybe it neutralizes then the conversation around it.
Yeah, it's always a tricky one. I made a piece that some elements of it ended up in the book before, where, I think one can say, well, words are specific and pictures are ambiguous. But I think you can also say the complete opposite thing. You can write poetic words and you can write technical pictures. I think, I'm not disagreeing even with what you said. It's just, I think it's complicated, and they strike us in very different ways. And they're certainly on some hand more readable, like, a 1-year-old or less can see 2 dots in a curve and see a face. Like, we can't help but do that. So there's ways in, but it's tricky. I just think it's a very different kind of thinking. And I think some of the reasons it's hard to talk about is because it's hard to talk about. Like, we don't have the language to talk about it. And that's I think one of the reasons we tend to dismiss what pictures can do. We tend to see them as, aesthetics, things that go on our wall, things that are pretty or entertaining, but we tend to dismiss their potential for thought because they're hard to put into words what they're doing. And they can do so much more. A body slumped over in a drawing, like those figures that are marching that are sort of slumped, I could describe that sort of field of things, but I think the sort of impact of an infinite plane of figures marching feels something. Yeah, I don't know. It's a really great question. I feel I need to spend a few days trying to answer it.
And I'm happy with your answer.
Oh, well,
and also to challenge this, that words can be very implicit and drawings can be very explicit. What I find fascinating about your book, or maybe more sophisticated comic books in general, is that when you zoom out, it looks like almost chaotic and you don't know where to start. And still, if you start in one corner, you guide the reader through the story, although it might not seem obvious at first. So how do you create that you make it so easy to follow the path without being too directional, too explicit?
Well, that's great observation. And I'm glad to hear you say that it's still easy to read, because I know that is the risk one runs in making the kind of layouts that I tend to make. So, I think, there's one school of thought about comics as this sequential art. So it's, there's a sequence of things and you read it in sequence. But I think the big crux of my talking about comics in the book is the simultaneity of a page, or even larger than that, but at least of the page, in that you see the whole at once, like you view a piece of art, and you can't help but start to make connections in multiple directions. So I think this comes back to your last question. I think the power of comics is not simply in sort of putting images in sequence, but it's in putting images in sequence and this sort of to making nonlinear connections at the same time. So you get the whole and the one at a time, all at the same time. And I try to relate that to how things work in our heads. Like, yes, we have this sort of linear perspective of time. I go from I'm talking to you now, I'm going to do something after, I'm going to do something after that. But my thoughts are not nearly so sequential. Something you've suggested has made me think about something there. I'm anticipating something later. My thoughts are all across. And so I think one of the strengths of comics, at least how I see them, is their ability to do both this sort of linear sequential thing and they're all at once, and see this different kind of connections, the way things are in our heads. I have this chapter called The Shape of Our Thoughts, and that's the chapter about comics. And I do a project with my visual communication course that's called The Shape of Our Thoughts, and they make something that they try to think about, what do my thoughts look like? Which is a question we never ask, probably, right? We don't, what does our thinking look like? And who knows what it looks like? But when you start to ask that question, people come up with really fascinating answers. I had a student make a bowl of Jell-O and suspend some things in her bowl of Jell-O, some words and pictures. And then she talked about, and this was my favorite part, how the Jell-O is kind of still, but it's always a little bit moving, and how that was kind of like her thinking. So anyway, it's a bit of an aside, but I think it's important. So how do I think the comics are sort of balancing this way we read with the way we look. And so for me, I make very, very detailed, dense drawings, and I try to not always do that, but it's hard for me to let go of that. But what actually takes me a longer amount of time is figuring out how the page is going to move and how all the elements on the page are going to work together. And so there's the part where there's no visible narrator, there's no story, there's no character. So each page is like trying to come up with what's the kind of metaphor to, I have a kernel of an idea I want to talk about, but then I got to find the right sort of metaphor for it. And then I want to think about how I want the reader to move through the page. How does that idea feel? And I know this happened in fairly early on in the work. My wife would walk by where I was working and she said, I haven't seen a page like that before. And then she'd walk by again and say, I didn't see a page like. And at some point I realized I am not going to make any page that repeats a composition. Like there is none that has the same structure of reading. And So that's a challenge for myself. That's another, even though it might seem out of the box, it's another set of boxes, right?
Mm.
So the work comes out of like, making a lot of iteration after iteration of the sketches and starting to see how these pieces start to fit together and how they suggest new pieces. And that's often the case. It's very rare that if never, that I say, this is what the page looks like and I put it down. It's here's some things and here's some things, and then I try stuff and then I draw it badly. And when I draw it badly, I start to see it in a different way. And then I draw it badly again, and then I say, oh, well, that's really interesting. There's some connections. And I keep doing it, and I keep doing it. And eventually I start to understand what it is I'm talking about. And then it gets tighter because I'm thinking about, very specific design choices. Like an example I give, if we were doing this with pictures, I think it's like 67 or something like that. The page on multimodality, there's a head and a typewriter and typewriter keys. There's hands typing on it. And there's a very specific choice where there's a cloud at the upper left that acts as a thought balloon, but also as a cloud. And then the cloud drops down into the head of a thermometer. I think this is right. I got to think of how these pieces fit together. I don't have it in front of me. Sorry. And it does all these very specific things, even though the page is sort of all over, but it does these very specific things to keep you on the left side of the page where I want you to read. It's like 67 or 65.
This is 67.
Oh, it's 65. It's one before that. Yeah. So look, can you just open it just a teeny bit more? Oh yeah, I see it. I see enough. But okay, so you can look at it yourself. But you can see there that there's the clouds there are keeping you in that upper, there's words there, and then they drop into that round, the thermometer thing, which then takes you into the, there's all these things to keep you on the left side. And then I've talked about this at length before, but the challenge here is how do I get you to move back up, right? Like I want you to move back up. And that's a real hard thing to do in comics. Like you want to read like even though you see them all over, you still want to sort of go left to right and top to bottom. So how do I get you to go back up? And the trick there, and you can see it was
the hand.
Having the hand was a late addition, the hand sort of as an arrow, and the way that box down at the bottom curves into the hand rather than having so then it becomes this design challenge, like so it's all these boxes that you're like trying to navigate. And I often feel like if you sort of if you put up enough rules around you and then trust that eventually you'll see your way through them, you get to a place you don't expect, which is really always, it's exhausting maybe, but it's always rewarding too, because you're like, wow, how did I think of that? And the truth is, I didn't really think of that. I drew a bunch of stuff with a bunch of rules, and eventually looking at it enough times, it taught me where it should go.
Which nicely fits back into your concept of the boxes, that basically you do need all these rules, you do need the boxes in order to explore what's in them. Because without the restrictions, without the rules, you wouldn't get there or wouldn't get this clarity.
Exactly.
And I really hope that the fellow facilitators who listen to that have the same clarity or the analogy in mind that I have, because when I heard you explaining this, I really had the design of a workshop in mind where you need to get all these ideas, you need to explore, you don't know what the solution is, and still you have to bring back the group to the next level. So let them explore and then tie it to the next level without making them feel pushed or pulled, but that it becomes kind of a natural process. Right.
I mean, I think that's the challenge. I mean, I think of, either workshops or my classes, like it's how do you give enough structure so that you're not lost, but enough freedom within it to go in your own direction. And I think that's always the challenge, but it's the exciting one. I mean, that's where the exciting things happen.
And since you're mentioning the class, in a sneaky way now, I bring in my one of my general questions that I didn't know how to place. But what would make a class fail? I would usually ask the question for a workshop.
Yeah.
But for a class, you just mentioned that you design it in a similar way, that you want the students to explore and then to come up maybe with their own reality solution understanding. What makes for you a bad class?
I don't know if I can answer what makes, I mean, I can, that's a really, what makes a bad class? I hope I don't give a lot of bad classes. That's a harder question. I mean, when does a class fail? I don't know. I mean, I can certainly picture times where I'm less satisfied than other times of the class, if that's what you mean. But I don't know. I don't know if I have an answer. I mean, I can think of ways that make these things succeed, and I can give examples of that. But it's harder to say.
So what makes it succeed then?
Let me try that, and then maybe I can get to the failing part on the other direction. I mean, let me offer some examples, and then you tell me if it's useful, and if it's not, I'll change directions, because here I am failing at this. So constraints to me, it's like that's how I run my classes a lot. I mean, how I run exercises in my classes, particularly the making specific ones. And so I'll just give you a simple example. Let's say I ask you to do something where you tell me a story of how you got here and, to school, and you can interpret that how you want. So already you can say, like, how did I literally get there that day? Or what was all the journey of my life to this moment, right? Like that's up to them. And then I say, let's do it in a 3-panel comic strip, and a 2-page comic. So you've gone and made 2 versions of it, right? So you've gone home. So everybody in class, so let's say you have 25 people, everybody in class has gone home and they made 2 versions, a 3-panel and a 2-page. And they've come back and they've done this thing. So now all of a sudden you have all the choices that they made for their 3 and for their 2, and sometimes they overlap, like they use the same panel. Sometimes they don't have anything to do with each other, but they've taught themselves an enormous amount about how the form works, about how the differences, and then they have 24 other people to look at who've also been trying the same constraint, which is kind of narrow, right? But it's wide open in you interpret it how you want. I mean, I think that's kind of what I meant by that's an example. I mean, the exercise, maybe I'll tell you, because I know it's a question that might come up. An exercise that I do a lot, I call grids and gestures, which I made up the first time I taught a class, comics class. And I've now done it a couple hundred times in workshops, and I start all my classes with it. And I've done it as a Twitter challenge a few times. And the prompt is pretty simple. You take a single sheet of paper and you think about the structure of your experience of a single day, and it could be that day, or it could be your typical day, or an average day, or a particular sort of extraordinary day. And you carve it up into some sort of grid-esque fashion that represents the shape of the experiences you move through in that day. And I want them to inhabit it, rather than with people or coffee cups or things, with some sort of lines or marks or gestures that represent how you felt or what you were up to throughout that day. And the trick with this, I mean, and I set it up a little bit more than I will now, but is to get them to understand enough about how I want them to approach it, like to think about organizing space and organizing sort of a reading flow without telling them too much. Mm-hmm. And I think this comes to the failing part. I think I could show them, here's an example of what it is, and then I will see 25 of those, right? Yeah. The dangerous part is that without showing them anything, there are some people who are going to be very nervous about it. It's an intentionally ambiguous prompt, right? Like talk about the shape of your day in the sort of grid-esque fashion. But those that trust it, and it's rare that I see people don't. I mean, they might take a little more encouragement than others. They end up some do it very dramatically different than I want. And a few of them break so many of the rules, it stops being quite as useful. Mm-hmm. I think, like they draw things, they don't do it, they just do whatever they feel like. So they've sort of abandoned any sense of the rules I've given. But even those tend to teach them something. But I think the kinds of results that come out of it are very, there's a commonality across the room, but then there's a signature to each of theirs that is very much like, you can look at your partner, the person sitting next to you at the table, and they've like drawn all these like little tiny boxes very carefully, and they're all got, and then this person has drawn these sort of swooping things, and they've, instead of reading left to right, there's reads in a circle. And now all of a sudden we have a different picture of what everybody's thinking kind of looks like, or at least in this particular context. And I think that, to me, that it opens up what they can do. It starts to show you it teaches you something about comics, which is true, but it also teaches you how much you know about thinking in a visual way that can be limited in another context. And I think, I'll say the reason I came up with this, and maybe this probably won't still answer your question, but is that I've seen things where you go to a workshop and somebody says, well, you divide your piece of paper into 6 boxes and tell about your day in those 6 boxes. And what they tend to do is draw a stick figure, of themselves or whatever across the day. And that's not bad, but they've basically sort of come with the skill, maybe they've learned a little bit about what are the key moments to show, but that hasn't really taught them a lot about how much they know about their own capacities for making marks and for thinking through marks. So I don't know. Sorry, those are things I do. I'm not sure it quite answers your question, but...
and maybe it's not relevant whether you do or not. Interesting what you tell, and I think it is. So how would you help then people to be more abstract or go more in depth in this exercise? Because I can perfectly see it happening. 6 boxes, my day. Okay, I draw a bed. I draw maybe a muesli bowl, work, the bus, and bed again.
Right.
So how do you help then the group or this individual to go deeper?
Well, I mean, again, I think giving them this sort of abstract thing, and with very little time. Mm-hmm. So that's part of it too. They have 7 minutes to do it when I do it as a workshop. So I think, time is a really useful constraint. And I wish I could do this to myself too, because it would really both speed me up and I think get me to let go of some of the habits that I have. That I think that sort of time, and I'll say this also, and this has now become very difficult in our current moment, that collaboration has been an enormous help in my classes. And this is, starting to get much more specific to comics, but there may be some overlaps with your work that, where just to give an example, let's just say I come up with some silly prompt for class, like every panel has to do something with an eye. Mm-hmm. And so everybody, we'll do 7 passes. So everybody gets their sheet of paper, they draw a first panel, whatever they feel like, but it has something to do with an eye, and then they give it to the next person. So, and then we do it again 7 times. And so the shape of the page isn't determined, what they're going to do. But what's interesting is like each sheet of paper from the first move starts to have a character that's very different than the other sheets of paper, because the first move like set it in motion. We did it. I think the most interesting example I've had recently was a pictureless comic. So they just used words. But like sound effects words. So they could be, and they were like visually dramatic. I mean, and here I'm talking about pictureless comics, but they were visually dramatically different from each other because, somebody started with like an explosion of letters. And then so the next person took it and did something with it. Whereas the other, the person who started the different piece of paper, it started with these sort of quiet moments. And then that one had gone that, so they had these characters, they had a characteristic to them that was quite identifiable. And I think what happens when you do things like that with like 2 minutes, like do your thing, 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes, that they have to let go of fear. Mm-hmm. They have to let go of perfection. And in the sort of cartooning world, they have to learn like shortcuts to make things that work, which is maybe less important for, that's a little more specific to our thing. But I do think that when you're making something that's not yours, mm-hmm. And you're sort of following along or just setting it into motion, that it frees you in a way that's really interesting and really hard to replicate on Zoom. I'm having a hard time with that, but that's, Someday we'll all be in the same room again.
Well, if you're using an online whiteboard.
Yeah, my daughter and I have tried that because she's on Zoom, kindergarten Zoom as well. The trick is you got to have everybody with the right everybody has to have something they can draw on the screen with. But yes, those things, maybe I will try that. Anyway, we don't need to go down that road at all.
And thank you for sharing this exercise, because I think even for non-comic students, it's interesting because there's this yes-anding. So a concept from improv theater where you would continue a story someone else started, which is totally verbal, but this is now in pictures. So it brings people out of the comfort zone. You need to understand what they're drawing and kind of build on it and just accept as it is and add your own little ideas. And to try to empathize, to see through the eyes and make it whole.
Yeah, no, that's it. I mean, yeah, you'd mentioned improv before, and that's so. I hadn't really thought about it. I thought about it being improvisation, but not the sort of improv that is really what it is. And it's so. I mean, watching improv is fascinating, and it's certainly the same way, right? Somebody starts. This prompt will lead to this kind of story, or I guess the second person might really shape it even more in that case. But they have this character that emerges. I keep using that word, but
and you create something together. You make the other person look good by adding something that increases the value. So I will try that out. I'll tell you.
And every person has so little to do with it. And you have no stake in it, really. I mean, you have a stake in wanting to keep it going, but you don't have that sort of ownership that can be paralyzing.
True, and then you don't feel the burden of perfectionism anymore.
Yeah. I don't know. That's the more I teach, the more I've been doing things like that, and seeing really exciting results about it. And I feel like that's pretty easily transferable to other kinds of work.
Yeah. Just to come back, and then I just realized that we are. I could go on and on forever.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.
Don't want to eat too much of your time. To come back to this simple exercise with the 6 squares, asking someone to tell their day. Mm-hmm. Would you then think that the way to help people to be less specific or to be more creative is just to change the exercise and not ask them to draw their day, but something more abstract?
I mean, you might be able to do it. I mean, the reason I came up with the grids exercise is because I wanted to go as far away from that the 6-box stick figure thing as I could. I'm really not trying to denigrate that. And there's plenty of good cartoonists who use that, and I think it's fine. It's just, like I said, I just think you come into it with the skills that you leave with, or you leave with the skills you came into. And what I see when I ask them to do something, abstract and very quickly and organizing space how they want, is like, somebody will put a box on top of a box so they overlap a little bit. And like, why did you do overlap? And so all of a sudden you can have a conversation about, well, at this moment, my kids are talking to me at the same time I'm making breakfast, at the same time I'm trying to get ready for work. So that feels like an overlapping moment. Whereas here, there's all these staccato moments or whatever those kinds of words are, that they can then turn around and analyze what they did in a really sophisticated way. And they all, what's shocking to me about it is that in 7 minutes, people can make this enormous amount of decisions and sophisticated decisions. And so what I see with it is that, rather than saying I'm a bad drawer, that if you sort of reconceive what drawing is, that it's making marks in space, sort of the organization of space more than it is about like representation. If you start to see it that way as a way of offloading your thinking and doing your thinking in collaboration with your paper, everybody can do it, right? We all do it. We all can do that level of it. Not everybody's going to maybe have the dexterity or be willing to train to have the dexterity, and I don't know where that falls, to draw in a certain way. But everybody can make some kind of mark that helps them think. And I think for me, just to come back to my own work, This work started very much about making complex ideas accessible, not simple, but accessible. But I think in making the work, it really became about how much I could think in ways that I couldn't think without the drawings, without all those sketches, a few of which are at the back of the book. The sketches are really teaching me what I'm doing. And what I see in classes and in workshops is that that's true of everybody. And it doesn't mean they're all going to be comics makers or drawers in any way, but it does mean that they all, in doing these kinds of things, can help themselves understand their own thinking in ways they couldn't. And I think that's transferable to every field on the planet. We're visual creatures. We're visual spatial creatures that move through the world. And if, words are super useful. I'm not trying to say anything anti-word in the least, but why not use, well, but to come back to the very beginning of this conversation, like the idea of unflattening is how do you bring in all the things that make you human? And I think that was what really came from me. Like I'd sort of suppressed my comics making for a long time because I saw it as like this thing over there, this sort of entertainment thing. But when I realized, that this was a way that I thought better and I could express myself better and articulate things better, and bringing it into my work, I think we spent a long time sort of trying to say, well, humans, to do smart things, we're supposed to look like that. But if instead we say, well, what are the things that humans can do? Well, humans make marks, and humans are visual and they're spatial. How do you bring that into your thinking? And I think if we do it, we start to be able to see ideas, to be able to make connections that we absolutely wouldn't have been able to do when we limit ourselves to only one mode. At the end of the day, maybe it comes out as a paper, and that's fine. But having those resources at your disposal is crucial in my perspective.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank
Got
you.
all fired up there.
And thank you also to bring it back to the beginning. And still, I always like to finish the conversation with, if someone fell asleep after minute 1 and just woke up and doesn't have time to listen to the entire conversation again, what would you like them to take away?
That last bit was about as good as I'm going to say it. If they fell asleep, well, good for them. People need sleep right now. I'd like them to think that, number one, there tends to be this attitude that I can't draw or I'm not creative. And I think that's false. I think by virtue of being human, by virtue of being a visual and a spatial creature, those are things we all have access to. And by understanding what that means in a different way, I think it can help us all think and see and make connections better than we could without it. I think and it is not just drawing. I mean, I think of people who've done dances in response to my work and stuff, like bringing in the different ways we make meaning in the world into our thinking and saying, oh, this counts. This is part of something I did. Why did I let that go? I think bringing those things into the conversation allows us to see in a much more dimensional way than we can without.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
And do you have a hashtag or not?
Do I have a hashtag? Unflattening is my hashtag, but no, I don't know how to sum up my work with the hashtag. I leave that to smarter people.
I like the unflattening hashtag. I just couldn't resist to.
No, fair enough. Fair enough.
Final question.
No, it's fine.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you for taking the time.
Oh, thank you so much, Miriam. That was lovely.
Thank you for staying tuned and listening to the show. I appreciate your attention, as I know how busy you are. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and engage by sharing your comments and thoughts, and visit workshops.work to download the one-page summary. I'm looking forward to seeing you back at the next episode, and I wish you a fruitful day.